Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome. I'm going to welcome you here in the audience, but also those joining us on the live stream. So welcome to you all as well. My name is Celeste Feta. I am the Joan P. Brock Director of Education and the Assistant Deputy Director for Education statewide in the library here at VMFA. And I'm really glad that you are joining us this evening. Coinciding with the Samurai Armor exhibition at VMFA, tonight's lecture, Samurai from War to Peace, will explore the transformation of Japan from its era of warring states to its era of peace. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Constantine Vaporis. Close, good. Thank you. Yeah. The Professor of History and Founding Director of the Asian Studies Program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Dr. Vaporis teaches Japanese and East Asian history and is the founding director of the Asian Studies Program. He received the Fulbright Scholars Award and NEH Fellowship for research in Japanese history. He's also the author of numerous books, including the Samurai Encyclopedia, a comprehensive guide to Japan's elite warrior class, and the soon-to-be-published Samurai in 12 Lives, which is due to come out next summer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Constantine Vaporis.
Thank you, Celeste. Oh, I am wired. Great. I'm told that I can't stray far from the podium, or I'll go off screen for the folks that are seeing this on live stream. So usually I like to pace. So good evening to all of you, and thank you for being here on the occasion of this amazing exhibition. This is my fourth time seeing different iterations of it, and congratulations to Lee Jen and all the VMFA staff for putting together a spectacular show. And thanks as well to Katie Domrat for all the wonderful arrangements for this visit. Last month, the speaker in this program gave a wonderful talk on the design elements of armor. But this evening, I want to do something rather different and to provide some human context for the artifacts in the exhibit by talking about the people for whom they were made, the people who actually used the objects, the samurai. I'll begin with some general comments about the samurai and then go on to present 3 brief biographical sketches of samurai whose lives spanned the entirety of the Tokugawa period, which runs from 1600 to 1868. The period from which over 80% of the artifacts in the exhibit were produced. So here we go. In popular media today, such as the anime series Samurai Champloo, still my favorite, and the recent popular miniseries Shogun, the samurai are presented as Japanese warriors of mythic status, an unchanging social force spanning more than 1,000 years, going back at least to the 11th century. Here we have an image of samurai in combat from the Heiji Rebellion scroll of the 13th century, depicting events that took place 2 centuries earlier. But the samurai of the Tokugawa period, again, our focus here today, seen in these various images, were quite unlike the warriors of earlier times. How were they different? Well, for one, the Tokugawa period was the only era, in fact, in which the samurai made up a fixed hereditary social order, about 6% of the population. In this damaged, but I think rather important woodblock print, we see the 4 social orders with the samurai represented by the figure in the top right, followed by the peasant in the top left, the farmer, merchant in the bottom left, and the artisan in the bottom right. Now, in principle, the samurai left manual labor to the peasants and to the artisans, while merchants carried out commercial functions. Samurai lived off the productive labor of the peasantry, whose main task was to grow rice. Rice was the main crop of this agricultural society. Samurai enjoyed many privileges during this time, including the right to carry, not a gun, but the right to carry 2 swords, the public use of a surname, and a place in the domain's register of retainers. Here we have such a register listing the names of all the vassals of the lord in one particular domain. What is a domain, you ask? To explain briefly the political situation at the time, the country was divided into about 250 domains or territories, depicted in a variety of colors here, each headed by a daimyo or warlord. The daimyo were semi-independent rulers, but were subject to the sovereign authority of the shogun from the Tokugawa family. His territories comprised about a quarter of the real estate in Japan at this time and are indicated by the color yellow on the map. The three hollyhock symbol you see there is the family crest of the Tokugawa. The shogun exercised a variety of powers over the daimyo, long list, I won't go over them all, but the most important one, most relevant to my discussion here tonight, was the alternate attendance, which required the daimyo to spend every other year to leave their castle towns, the headquarters of their domains, and travel to Edo and to wait on the shogun every other year. This went on for over 200 plus years. Here we see the daimyo embarking on his journey to Edo, leaving his castle town. So how did the samurai, two of whom you see in the front of this image, foreground, how did they rationalize their position in society? Eating food without growing it, using utensils without actually manufacturing them. A famous scholar of the mid-17th century argued that samurai in peacetime, quote, should set a high example of devotion to duty. His conduct should provide a model of virtuous living for the other social classes to follow. In other words, samurai were to be role models, teachers for the rest of society, and enforcers of a moral way that today we know by the popular name of Bushido. A second point that I'd like to make is that the Tokugawa samurai were a military elite presiding over society that remained at peace for more than 2 centuries. This was in stark contrast to earlier periods in Japanese history, particularly the century-long period of civil war, known as the Warring States period, that preceded it, represented by this beautiful triptych depicting the brave warriors of one of the most important clans of that time, the Takeda. By the way, the leader of the Takeda was this man, Takeda Shingen, and he's available for sale in the gift shop. I bought one. I have a whole shelf of samurai figures. But seriously, during the Tokugawa period, many Japanese celebrated the end of warfare and referred to their society as the realm at peace, tenka taihei. If you read Japanese, you know, top to bottom, tenka taihei. Or they just spoke about the great peace. They understood that they were in an unusual time. Of course, Tokugawa Japan stood in sharp contrast to what was going on in Europe, which you know was racked by uprisings, rebellions, and revolts. And speaking of Europe, Japanese leaders had made the wise decision by 1639 to expel the meddlesome Catholic priests and also all the Western merchants from the country, except for a few Dutch, whom they left continue to conduct business. This would later be referred to as the closed country. And no doubt this too contributed to the Great Peace. A third point I'd like to make is that Tokugawa period samurai were, for most of the period, not a landed or land-holding aristocracy. This might be a little bit hard to digest. They were a military elite who became disconnected from the land over which they once exercised direct authority. Daimyo lords undercut their vassals' authority over the land and the people living on it, in part by forcing the majority of their vassals to reside near them in castle towns. So samurai became urban dwellers, disconnected, removed from the land over which, in theory, they ruled. And they lived in castle towns. Today in Japan, there's still about a dozen beautiful original castles that you can visit. Importantly, feudal elements in the social contract between the daimyo and samurai retainers became increasingly fictive in nature. What do I mean? Well, instead of the lord giving his samurai a piece of land in exchange for military service, he gave them stipends or salaries from his domain's warehouses. These were paid in bales of rice or in a combination of rice and cash. As a result, samurai became increasingly dependent on their daimyo lords. During the previous period of warring states, if you watched FX Shogun, you know what I mean. It was a chaotic time when samurai changed sides at every opportunity. Jesuit priests who were in Japan at the mid to late 16th century, and we see a couple of them here, they actually noted how disloyal samurai were. It's so counterintuitive to, goes against the image we have of samurai as these fiercely loyal creatures. They weren't. And so they switched sides whenever it benefited them. Here we see two samurai on the left, one about to take communion, and his attendant here outside. But during the Tokugawa peace, it was extremely difficult, if not outright impossible, to switch lords. So loyalty became unconditional and impersonal. Unconditional and increasingly impersonal in nature. Once the country was pacified in the early 17th century, samurai gradually underwent a transformation from a group of illiterate or minimally literate warriors to a cultured bureaucratic elite. And that, to me, is the main story of the Tokugawa period. This transformation, or civilizing, if you will, was critical to the forging of the Great Peace, and achieved in part through education, not surprisingly. Education either received, Confucian-based education received at home, or at domain schools that developed. And these are examples of two that still remain, at least in part, today. But under peacetime conditions, as you might imagine, samurai struggled to redefine their identity as an elite who demonstrated loyalty primarily through bureaucratic service rather than military action on the battlefield. An important part, though, of that redefinition was to maintain a balance between the so-called twin ways, the military arts and the civil or literary arts, or the arts of war. And there were no fewer than 18 different schools of martial arts, including, you might be surprised, swimming. Swimming's an important martial art. If you're in full armor and you've got to cross that moat, you better know how to swim. And the arts of peace. So a samurai could serve his lord in a variety of ways, in either the administrative or military side of the government. As a bureaucrat, as you see in the bottom left here, a specialist in the military arts, including those who acted as bodyguards for their lord, as we see around here, surrounding the lord in the palanquin, and down here as well. As a tea master. Yes, you could serve as a tea master, or even as an artist. Two of the chapters of my new book concern these artists who produce these amazing paintings here. Let me make two additional points about Tokugawa samurai. 2.5 centuries of peace, as you can imagine, naturally eroded their military character, but not in any uniform or linear manner. And Westerners who came to Japan in the middle of the 19th century had reason to respect and to fear the samurai that they encountered. In peacetime, samurai remained fiercely proud of their heritage and identity as warriors. So the story of samurai of earlier times remained an important part of their lives through both literary and visual culture. An important part of this visual culture, here we go, are these, mushae, or warrior pictures. These became insanely popular in the 19th century, but their subject were the warriors of the 14th and 15th and early 16th century. So they represented, or rather reflected, a nostalgia for much earlier times when warfare was rampant. We also see a similar trend with weapons, and I'm not an expert in this to talk about it much, but particularly with swords, where we see in the 19th century the production of swords in the earlier the styles of the 12th through the 14th centuries. As I mentioned, samurai had the privilege of wearing the two swords, the daisho. It was an essential part of a samurai's attire, much like the six-gun was to the cowboy in the American West. No other social group was allowed to wear the two swords. And in principle, a samurai with his long sword could cut down a commoner who did not show sufficient respect. But the reality, of course, was much more complicated, as suggested by this screenshot from a Japanese game show, where we see the samurais cutting down the commoner, but then has to go and report it to his official and explain his actions and rationalize. Was the level of disrespect sufficient to warrant this, and so on. So it was a lengthy process of deliberation. As this might suggest, to a large extent, samurai were actually discouraged from exercising the military functions that had been essential to their identity up to that point. So these are some of the basic elements. I could talk much longer, but I won't. These are the main points that stand out. So let me now shift gears then and move on to some of the biographical sketches. And I want to begin with a very familiar figure for me from a favorite part of Japan, in the southern island of Tosa of Shikoku. This is a warrior named Yamauchi Kazutoyo. In East Asia, of course, the surname comes first, so Yamauchi is the family name, Kazutoyo his given name. His life provides a window onto the years between the violence of the Warring States period and the beginning of the 2.5 centuries of the Great Peace. Kazutoyo is the archetype of the daimyo of this transitional period. Born into a family of warriors of rather imprecise lineage, he experienced the loss of family at an early age. By the age of 14, he was basically on his own. And so he bounced from master to master 4 different times and fought in his first battle at age 15. So he came of age during a time of civil war when a number of daimyo were beginning to build larger domains, as we see the political map at this time. Now, if you're a quick reader, you'll notice that the name Yamauchi isn't anywhere to be found on this. He was not a daimyo, not a warlord by this time. He was pretty much a nobody, a low-ranking vassal of a daimyo who was very powerful and very ascendant on his way up. A man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi. I'm sorry, this is a picture of Kazutoyo from a video game. We have no idea what he looked like as a young boy, so we'll go with this. I skipped over one. Here we see his overlord here, Hideyoshi. If you watched FX Shogun, you know him as Taiko, and Hideyoshi's boss, Oda Nobunaga. And if you've been to the exhibit, this is the print from the exhibit. Nobunaga's on the horse, and Hideyoshi's bowing to him here. So Hideyoshi, the man bowing, was Kazutoyo's direct overlord. Now, Kazutoyo's rise was marked by a series of heroic acts that may strike us as suspiciously hagiographic or apocryphal in nature. As a 15-year-old, in his first armed combat, Kazutoyo was part of a party riding with his overlord out of the castle, and when they were set upon by a group of enemy warriors. His companions turned and fled. Kazutoyo bravely charged, and then when his companions saw that he hadn't turned with them, they did an about-face and headed back to support him. This is kind of boilerplate hero stuff, right? There's also the story of Kazutoyo and his wife, Chiyo, depicted here in this statue, which stands not far from the other one I showed you, both at the foot of Kochi Castle. And this amazing horse that she purchased for him, as we'll see, in effect, purchased for him. Chiyo was the daughter of a minor military lord, and she's especially well known for using the entire contents of her dowry that she was given when she married him and squirreled away. She wisely didn't show him the money, tucked it away, 10 gold coins, waiting for just the right time. So her husband went to the horse market looking for a horse, saw a beautiful animal, but was discouraged because he didn't have the money to purchase it. So he comes home dejected, tells his wife the story, and what does she do? Of course, she pulls out from her mirror case the 10 gold coins, you can see here, which allowed him to go on and purchase it. This print is much later, from the 19th century. The story of Chiyo, of course, is immortalized later as showing the sacrifices and the wisdom of Japanese women at the time. So after purchasing the horse, Kazutoyo took part in a equestrian exercise involving the mounted retainers of Oda Nobunaga, his boss's boss, where his impressive steed caught the eye of the Lord's attention. Somehow, and we're not sure how, this led to his rising through the ranks quickly. Finally, as a 28-year-old, he was fighting in support of his lord Hideyoshi against the forces of a rival daimyo when Kazutoyo was shot in the face by an arrow from the bow of an enemy of high repute, famous warrior. This is said to be the actual arrow. The arrow pierced Kazutoyo's face, entering from the corner of the left eye and exiting through the back part of his mouth on the right side. This might remind you of Prince Henry, later King Henry V of England, who was shot in the face with an arrow during a battle in 1403. Well, neither man retreated from battle. In Kazutoyo's case, he kept on going with the arrow piercing his face and was able to kill his adversary and take his head. Now, I should give you a trigger warning here because what follows is a little bit graphic. A vassal tried to dislodge the arrow from Kazutoyo's face, but the shaft broke off. Taking the arrowhead in his teeth, the vassal tried to extract the projectile, but was no more successful. Unable to bear it any longer, Kazutoyo ordered him, "Step on my face and pull it out." And he did. The incident greatly bolstered Kazutoyo's reputation with his lord, who doubled the size of his fief. I'm not sure what the vassal got, but he got to keep the arrow. It's now in his family's museum in this remote part of the Kochi area. Now, had Kazutoyo worn one of these, as you know from the exhibit here, it might have deflected the arrow a little bit, who knows. But I guess at one point I want to make, Kazutoyo was not a very wealthy warrior. He was not a warrior of high standing. He certainly could not afford anything like this. Many of the beautiful objects that you see in this exhibit were meant for elite samurai. The common samurai could not afford them. So it's not surprising that he wasn't wearing one and he got an arrow in his face. So these stories that I told you may be truthful, at least in part, and reveal something of his character, but it's clear that Kazutoyo's fortunes were tied with those of his lord Hideyoshi. Over a career of a little less than 30 years, as his vassal, Kazutoyo's land holdings increased 8 times in 8 different stages. By the end of this time, he was a warlord himself, a daimyo. This is the first formal portrait we have of Kazutoyo as daimyo. And you'll notice here he's not in armor. He's in the attire of a courtier. Japanese samurai were very much attracted to court culture, of course, because they were cultural upstarts. So, of course, they wanted to rub themselves in, take advantage and associate themselves with the elegant court culture of Kyoto. So as a daimyo, he was in control of a mid-sized domain that included a small castle. So all of this is important, but what is most important about his life is that his experience in the final phases of the unification of the country are emblematic of what was going on across the country. So when his lord Hideyoshi, or Taiko for you FX Shogun fans, when he died in 1598, a power struggle ensued, right, between rival daimyo. They duked it out. They met on a battlefield in a place called Sekigahara. 160,000 men, largest battle to date in Japanese history. This is a screen done much later of the battle. We see at the top the forces, the coalition of Tokugawa Ieyasu on the right-hand side with the red flags. Ieyasu won the day, his coalition, bringing to an end the Warring States period. So Ieyasu was the third of the 3 unifiers, Hideyoshi being the second, and Nobunaga the first. So 3 years after this battle, Ieyasu was in a strong enough position to twist the emperor's arm to appoint him as shogun. The emperor was largely a symbolic figure residing in Kyoto. From this point then, 15 generations of Tokugawa, the head of Tokugawa family, served as shoguns. Kazutoyo stood out among the many men who who rode Hideyoshi's coattails to become daimyo by making the wise decision before this battle, even though he wasn't a vassal of Tokugawa Ieyasu's, to support him. This was terribly important because once Kazutoyo did, others saw what he did and joined ranks. And so Tokugawa Ieyasu was forever indebted to him. Even though he was just a minor lord, he came to the battle with only 2,000 men. He wasn't a big player. Nonetheless, his decision to join him had such an impact that Ieyasu was forever grateful to him. This is Kazutoyo's surcoat or military jacket that he wore. It's a little bit tattered from time. This is Tokugawa Ieyasu on the left. This is a little better picture of Kazutoyo's surcoat. And here you can see how it was actually meant to be worn over the armor. And this is a rather spectacular example of one in better condition than Kazutoyo, so I wanted to share that with you as well from the exhibit. So what did Kazutoyo get for his wise decision? He was moved from a rather small domain in central Japan to this, received the lower portion of the Shikoku Island here. Essentially a threefold increase in the size of his domain. And this is his family crest here on the right. So Kazutoyo's experience was part of the greatest transfer of land holdings in Japanese history. After the Battle of Sekigahara, almost 100 daimyo family lines were eliminated, crushed, eliminated for all time. Another 43 daimyo were transferred to other parts of Japan to smaller or less advantageously positioned domains. So it was a major kind of shifting of the political map of the country. And as we know, Kazutoyo was rewarded quite generously. This is him later in life. You can see he's a little bit tired. He received this new domain at the age of 56, battle-weary by this point. Now moving into the new domain, moving from central Japan to this location on Shikoku Island, he was coming essentially as an invading force, an invading army, taking over the domain from a warlord with long roots in the territory. So it's not a very great situation to be facing. He had a small army. Knowing this, he asked for help. He asked Tokugawa Ieyasu to send him troops, which he did, 8 boatloads full. Nonetheless, they were met with resistance by the samurai who were loyal to the old guy, the old lord, and who threatened to fight to the death unless their lord could keep half of his domain. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So a standoff ensued for over a month, neither side budging. The resistance was finally put down when some retainers loyal to the old lord decided to open the gates to the castle and let in the opposing side for fear that otherwise their lord would be put to death. Well, the lord's life was spared, but to show his displeasure at this month-long period of resistance, Tokugawa Ieyasu's representative ordered the beheading of almost 300 retainers of the lord whose forces had resisted the takeover, exposing them to the elements for all to see. Then he sent them, preserved in salt, to his overlord in Edo. This cleared the way for Kazutoyo, by now, as I said, 56 years old and pretty tired, and the remainder of his army to enter the domain. Well, having come in a position of weakness, as you might imagine, Kazutoyo was determined to assert his authority, and he did so in a violent and rather underhanded manner. To celebrate the inauguration of his rule, he invited those remaining retainers of the former lord, as well as local elites, to a sumo wrestling tournament. Sumo wrestling is also a martial art, maybe surprised to know. This was to be held on the picturesque Katsurahama beach, still very popular with tourists. Isn't it beautiful? Well, taking advantage of their presence, though, Kazutoyo's forces seized 73 members of the local resistance and crucified them in the shallows of the bay. With this, most of the resistance was crushed. 2 years later, there would be one more minor uprising, but that was put down in an equally heavy-handed manner. This story is important to tell, not to shock you, but because the Tokugawa period is well known as being a realm at peace, it's easy to forget that that peace was forged in blood, a lot of it, not just at Sekigahara, but in a number of places across the country, where resistance to new rulers by retainers of the old lords and uprisings by peasants took place. So with active resistance to his rule put down, and senior retainers of the previous lord exiled, Kazutoyo could make a fresh start in his territory. He didn't have to remove any retainers from their ancestral lands, so he could take bold steps to centralize authority. He took hold of twice the amount of land that the previous lord had to hold it personally. He also set about building a new castle, the Kochi Castle, to be the center of his new city. Across Japan, other daimyo were doing this. More than 150 cities were being constructed around Japan and at an unprecedented rate. Places like that are still big cities today: Osaka, Kanazawa, Okayama, Nagoya, to name a few. From his castle keep of the new citadel, Kazutoyo enjoyed a broad view of the growing city below. This is how it looks today, obviously. Castle keeps were designed to be the last stronghold in the event of an invasion, but ironically, most were built after the civil war stopped. They remained symbol towers, emblematic of the daimyo's power, but never used for their intended purpose. Initially, Kazutoyo's retainers were granted fiefs. This was the accepted practice going back in the Warring States period, but his successors over the next 50 years, using a carrot and stick type policy, drew the samurai off the land, transforming them into salaried soldiers and bureaucrats. As an advisor to a lord of a different domain said, the retainers are indeed the lord's personal possessions, receiving stipends from the domain granary and living in housing provided by the lord, totally dependent on him. After Kazutoyo's death, the same Yamauchi family continued for 14 generations. His successors would not have to experience warfare again for more than 2 centuries. The peace dividend would be great. It led to opportunities for the samurai to follow new intellectual, artistic, even in some cases scientific pursuits, in addition to their prescribed duties as military men and civil administrators. But the peace would take a toll, which brings me to the second of our 3 samurai, Kumazawa Banzan. Again, we don't have a picture of him as a young man, but this is from a Japanese manga, so we'll go with that. And with his life, we jump forward a few decades. The harmful effects of the Great Peace were immediately observable to Banzan. When given orders to accompany his lord to the shogun's capital as his page, the 16-year-old wrote, quote, "I was on the point of getting fat," end quote. And it wasn't just Banzan. He observed that this was true of many other samurai around him. Their corpulence, he noted, resulted in a lack of agility. Were he to continue on this path, Banzan concluded, he would never become a first-class warrior. Perhaps he was inspired to change his ways after reading the orders the Lord gave to the men who were assigned to accompany him to Edo, a 400-mile, 16-day trip from Okayama to Edo in the east. This is Okayama Castle as it looks today. This is for the alternate attendants that I talked about earlier. In preparation for the trip, the men appointed to accompany the Lord were ordered to build up their physical conditioning several months beforehand. They got their orders to go several months beforehand. Because in the daimyo's words, quote, "Today's young people are not in as good condition as 60-year-olds were in the past," end quote. Some things don't change, right? Here we see a daimyo, now we do. We see a daimyo procession moving at a fast clip, which they did, but the men moved in a much more measured and stately manner when passing through large population areas, post stations and castle towns on the way, as I'll show you in a couple minutes. The processions could have anywhere from 100 to as many as 2,000 to 3,000. This is the procession of the largest of the daimyo, other than the Tokugawa, daimyo of Kaga. It had almost 3,000 men in it. Yeah, I'm not taking my word for it. Don't count them. Banzan's Okayama was a large domain, not as big as Kanazawa. They typically had 1,600 men. So when Banzan took part in the procession, he was part of a rather long retinue. So every year, tens of thousands of samurai were coming from all over Japan to Edo, spending a year and going back home. Daimyo processions drew largely on the format of a military force, setting out for battle, and footmen carried weapons, which you can see here, spears and bows and firearms, but also regalia and other implements that marked the daimyo's status for all to see. Here you see the procession passing through a city with the spectators out viewing it. And on the right, this is from a book of regalia, heraldry, where the informed observer could tell who was going by the number and type of regalia that were in the procession. The regalia were held upright and tossed in the air for effect at important performance points in the journey. Many of the men in the procession also walked with a gait that made it seem as if they were swimming in air. In short, the processions provided an opportunity to parade samurai dominance, visually and symbolically, up and down Japan's highways. They also provided the most common opportunity for the display of the samurai's weapons. Armor, on the other hand, is a more complicated subject. Despite what you may read, generally, samurai did not travel in full armor on alternate attendants. Think about it, walking 400 miles in full armor. They had a lighter version for those who wore armor, but most, as you could see in these images, did not wear armor. Even in terms of headgear, as we see, there are a number of these beautiful artifacts in the exhibit here. Samurai typically wore simple conical military camp-style helmets known as jingasa, rather than the more ornate types, usually meant for display in a samurai's residence, such as these magnificent, spectacular helmets. That's a direct translation of the Japanese term, kawari kabuto. Only high-ranking samurai obviously could afford something so beautiful. Helmets with various shapes, such as these, in clockwise order from the top left or going around. This is one of the 7 gods of good fortune. A crab. I don't think you need me to tell you that. You may need me to tell you that this is an eggplant. Snow pea and rabbit ears. I'm happy to talk about what these all mean. Why would a samurai put rabbit ears on his head during the Q&A? But let me say the important point here is one that I think is rather important to make, that samurai culture is usually seen as being very severe, very stern, and it could be, and it was in various respects, but it also had a very important playful element to it, and I think that's what's going on here. But there are more direct meanings to these objects that were selected, and this is my all-time favorite, the ears. They were detachable ears. Amazing. Now, non-elite samurai couldn't afford those beautiful helmets, but they could perhaps afford an ordinary metal bowl helmet such as this. But they could customize them to a certain extent by replacing the various attachments. And you see a number of them here. I'm going to give a shout out here to Baltimore. These are from the Walters Art Museum. So you could personalize your your helmet with a family crest, with animal shapes, insects, including the ever-popular dragonfly. You probably don't need me to explain why a dragonfly would be so important to a samurai, because they charge straight ahead, they don't go backwards. A samurai's armor usually was placed on display in his residence and worn only infrequently, such as a formal audience with the Lord or for some special ceremony, and he would often receive his first set of armor when he came of age. Sometime around 12 to 15, it varied. This is a lovely father and son set. I'm hoping nobody gets the idea here and goes out and buys one of these. But getting back to Banzan, though, for a moment, he walked all the way to Edo, which likely got him into shape if he wasn't already beforehand. Regardless, he was determined not to become soft during his year in the big city. So he adopted a strict regimen of exercise and diet. His official duties in Edo were not very onerous. This allowed him to pursue his new regimen with zealousness and extreme mental discipline. He stopped eating rice and fine-tasting foods. He forswore drinking sake. And he slept with his girdle tight at night. He also said he abstained from sex for a decade. Whether he did all this, we don't know. But while on duty, when he was in the domain's compound in Edo, he used the martial arts hall to practice with his halberd a long wooden-handled pole weapon, as you see here, and a long sword. At night, after duty hours, when everything was quiet, he took out a wooden sword from his chest in the barracks and went into the dark courtyard, where he'd go through a series of military drills. His routine also involved an element of what we might call today extreme sports, running over the roofs of buildings inside the compound like a proverbial ninja. Those who noticed his nocturnal habits thought him possessed by a goblin. During the summer months, as well as the winter months, he went to extremes to stay in shape, to avoid the ill effects of an urban lifestyle. Banzan's descriptions of his late teenage years suggest that he had an ambition to distinguish himself as a warrior, like the heroes found in warrior epic literature. He seemed determined to follow this path of the warrior. And then in 1637, a major disturbance occurred in Kyushu, the southern island, known as the Shimabara Rebellion, depicted in this print here, where you can see the outline of the castle walls here and the invading army here. The rebels are inside. They're not going to get depicted in this screen. So during Banzan's lifetime, Banzan's second tour, this disturbance broke out. It seemed to give him the opportunity to distinguish himself as a samurai. He was in Edo. His lord was back in Okayama and was given orders by the shogun to raise forces to go down and help put down this insurrection. What did Banzan do? He leaves Edo without permission, goes back to Okayama. By the time he gets there, the insurrection has been put down. For disobeying orders, Banzan was released from service, made a masterless samurai. Clearly, he thought it was worth the risk, but he calculated wrongly. So what happens to Banzan? So he was forced by his actions, becoming a masterless samurai, to reflect on his life course. And he came to the conclusion rather quickly that he had been misdirecting his efforts by focusing on the military side of his identity as a samurai. He must have been painfully aware as well that his lack of education would limit his path forward in an alternative, non-military path of feudal service. And so he decided to turn a new leaf. Years later, he would explain, quote, "When I was young, I knew not that there was anything worth doing besides military drill. I spent my energy upon useless matters. After I fell ill in the 21st year, I learned for the first time to read the 4 books of Confucius," as we see here. This is an actual portrait now of a more bookish, scholarly Banzan. Banzan was profoundly moved by this body of knowledge, Confucianism, and zealously pursued deep learning. Realizing there was no future for him in trying to become a warrior's warrior, he embraced wholeheartedly his new life of study. Now, while the circumstances surrounding Banzan's path of self-realization were unique to him, his experience was part of a broader transformation of samurai identity underway across the country. We see it, for example, in a writing primer used by samurai around this time. A primer was used to practice calligraphy. This passage centers on an extended simile. A boy embarking on study is like a warrior going off to battle. Things like inkstones, ink, and paper are like armor. Practicing writing characters one by one and memorizing them is an even greater deed than that of a single warrior sneaking into a castle and destroying a great enemy in large numbers. Ordinarily, samurai boys were expected to aspire to the life of a warrior and devote themselves to acquiring skills needed to serve a lord. But in peacetime, the focus of that service was to be rechanneled from military to peaceful pursuits. Yet Banzan's immersion in Confucian studies did not lead him to reject the profession of the samurai as a military man, or the samurai ideal of fitness and martial arts. He continued to maintain a regular regimen of physical fitness, although he did give, quote, 10,000 times 10,000 thanks, end quote, for being able to live peaceably in an age of civil order. In Japanese culture, 10,000 just means a lot. He also appears to have repudiated the spirit of military adventurism that was still, in some quarters in society, regarded as the proper attitude for a samurai. He said, "For a samurai to hope for fame and advancement and to long for an incident is to lack discretion." His immersion in Confucian studies also tempered his view of several samurai practices. For one, tameshigiri, the test cutting of swords on the bodies of convicted criminals, a practice which he condemned. This is a diagram showing places to cut to test your sword. 7 years later, Banzan, a more mature and educated man of 27, I don't know if this is precisely 7 years later. I think we fast forwarded a little more, but you get the picture. He's older and wiser here. Banzan was pardoned for his indiscretion and returned to service in Okayama to serve the same lord as a scholar official and his private secretary. He accompanied the lord once again to Edo, which by now was a major city of 400,000, on par with London. There in Edo, Banzan's reputation as a scholar grew quickly. He attracted students from all ilks of life, including daimyo and retainers of the Tokugawa shogun. He continued to live a fascinating life, which I don't have time here to describe further, except to say that later in his retirement, he wrote a polemical tract criticizing, or rather proposing, that all samurai leave castle towns and go back and live in the countryside. As you might imagine, this did not go over well with his daimyo, who ordered him into exile. He lived a long period of exile. To sum up Banzan's life then, he grew up thinking that the way to excel as a samurai was to master the arts of war, but during his lifetime, the Great Peace set in, took hold firmly. So instead of continuing on that path of military training, he shifted course to concentrate with equal zeal on the arts of peace. Banzan was one of the first, and I think one of the most articulate samurai voices to confront the issue of the peacetime warrior. Let's fast forward now from the end of the 17th century to the 19th century and the third and final biographical snapshot. One of my characters I was most, I think, favorite to write about, Mori Masana. Now, if you went through the exhibit, you might have noticed the name Mori. It's a different Mori. It's a Mori with a long O. That's why we study Japanese for a lifetime and never get it right. It's not the same family. This is just Mori. Mori Masana, who came from the same domain as our first samurai tonight, Tosa. Masana was not a daimyo, not even a daimyo's close advisor, like Banzan. He was the fourth son of an ordinary samurai from the same domain, as I said, as the first samurai, Kazutoyo. Given his birth order, he couldn't even expect to succeed his father to continue his position in the mountain guard unit. He was not of sufficient importance to have his portrait painted, like Banzan. Nevertheless, Masana's life provides an excellent example of a samurai who from early on successfully balanced the twin ways, the ways of war and the ways of peace. His life shows us the long-term impact that great peace had on the samurai as a civilized elite, and the positive impact that alternate attendance had on individual samurai. Think of it kind of as similar to the Grand Tour in Europe for an English gentleman, where they would gain experience of the world. His life also demonstrated the extent to which samurai had become entwined in Japan's commercial economy, even though samurai were not supposed to engage in commercial activities. He did so with a vengeance, as I'll show you in a second. Masana was above all a man of letters, though, and a lifelong learner, a tireless writer who left us 10 volumes of travels to and from, of his diary accounts of travel to and from Edo over 3 decades, numerous historical accounts. He even wrote a biography of his father, who had died when Masana was a young boy at 6 years old. He gathered up oral accounts of people that remembered his father, a very touching biography. He also had a rare sense of humor, which doesn't often come through in these samurai diaries, that his humor punctuated these diaries. I'll give you one example. The procession was delayed leaving for Edo, so he and a group of his samurai were goofing around, playing at sumo wrestling, and he got injured his leg. Think about that when you're about to begin walking 400 miles to Edo. Well, somehow he was able to do it, and when he got to Edo, he wrote in his diary, he was very proud that he had made it, and he said, I made it all the way on 3 legs. meaning that he had a cane and he hobbled all the way there. So it's pretty unusual to see this kind of humor. One of the main themes that emerges, though, from Masana's diaries is a strong sense that Tokugawa Japan was a peaceful society, particularly for one when a large segment of the population was walking around with two swords. There was only one occasion in which Masana almost had cause to draw his sword to defend himself. It was while he was in Edo, out sightseeing, and happened to witness a confrontation between two samurai. This naturally drew a crowd, and Masana was one of them. And for some reason, the men involved in this altercation, one of them saw Masana looking at them and kind of beeline towards him, threatening him with his sun umbrella. Masana told the samurai that if he hit him with that umbrella, he would have no choice but to draw his sword and to cut the man down. This action would inevitably have led to Masana being forced to commit ritual suicide. In short, Masana wrote in his diary, both men would die a, quote, dog's death, by which he meant a meaningless one. The lesson that Masana took away from this incident, as he later brushed in his diary, quote, "You must take care walking the streets of Edo," end quote. Indeed, the potential for violence, as I said, was always there with so many armed people, but the overall pacific nature of life is what stands out above all. Fortunately for Masana, he didn't have to draw his sword that day. The only recorded instance of him using a sword to cut the flesh of an animal was to test the sharpness of a newly purchased blade. Masana went to the market and purchased a boar's head, and he and a friend used it to do test cuts of the new swords they purchased. They were very happy with the quality of their swords. Then, of course, they took the boar's head and they cooked it and ate it. What else could you do with the boar? As you maybe saw in the exhibit here, boar's hair is used to line the outside of the quiver here. Masana made no fewer than 5 trips to Edo during his lifetime to serve his lord. On the first of these, in 1828, he was not part of the procession like this. He was given special permission to travel alone, to travel to Edo separately at his own pace for training in martial arts and scholarly studies. Think of this like a scholarship to study overseas. The ultimate purpose of this was to make Masana better educated, more skilled, and therefore more valuable to his lord. Through his travels to and from Edo, retainers like Masana, like all retainers who took part in alternate attendance, were able to discover their country of Japan. Masana passed through no fewer than 16 castle towns on his way to Edo. Of course, since the first time he wasn't part of an official procession, he could stop wherever he wanted, could sightsee and get a fuller sense of the rich culture that united the country, that transcended the political boundaries of a country divided into 250 distinct domains. Part of that experience also involved living for a year in arguably the world's largest city of Edo at this time, over 1 million people, and taking part in its rich popular culture, including festivals, temple and shrine exhibitions of art, not to mention the pleasure quarters. They were always very clever writing about the pleasure quarters. They wrote that they visited and left out any details. This panoramic photo, of course, comes from when point in the mid-19th century when foreigners come to Japan. It's a beautiful panoramic photo, but it's taken from the top of Mount Atago, which is the highest point in Edo. So anybody new to Edo for the first time would travel there, to get a view of the city. And you can see some of the samurai barracks here in the foreground. So in Tokugawa society, hereditary principles prevailed. Sons served in the positions held by their father, generation after generation. But as a fourth son, that wasn't in Masana's future. Nevertheless, he was adopted out into another samurai family without an heir. This was a terribly important and frequent practice in Tokugawa Japan. Hereditary principles were supposed to supersede talent, but his intellect and outstanding personal character became apparent quickly to domain officials who appointed him, even on his year when he was going to study. They gave him special jobs to do, one of which was to serve as a personal bodyguard to the Lord. One time, a big fire broke out in Edo, and the Lord had to be moved from place to place as the fire shifted, and for that he received a large reward. But Masana's primary mission during his first visit to Edo was to promote his education. So Masana put on his formal clothes, the kamoshimo, this formal stiff-shouldered outfit, and went and interviewed different teachers across Edo. He was interested in various martial arts and Confucian studies and what a Japanese at that time called military learning, which was in essence strategy and the history of famous battles and that sort of thing. And for propriety's sake, since he was going to interview these important teachers, he hired a steward for the day, someone to come along and carry his extra pair of straw sandals and care to his needs. This was an important marker of status. You didn't just go by yourself as a samurai. The martial art Masana was most interested in was horseback riding. He engaged an instructor in the art while he was in Edo and visited the domain's riding ground every single day for practice. Some days he rode 2 or 3 different horses to improve his skills. Now, being skilled in horseback riding was important to the identity of Tokugawa samurai. There's an excellent placard in the exhibit on horse riding. I encourage you to go back and read it if you didn't the first time. So these skills were very important and put to important use during an annual event in his domain called the First Riding. It took place early in the new year. During the first riding, the samurai, in full view of other samurai and commoners who gathered for the event, galloped full speed down an 860-meter-long course, down a major road near the main gate of the castle. That's not the castle here, but this is equivalent to where the trolley lines run today in Kochi. You can see the straight thoroughfare. So here we see a number of warriors warming up before heading down the course in their armor. A misstep or tumble would bring the rider more than a momentary feeling of shame. The Lord and his top officials would be waiting from a position of honor about halfway down the course. The Lord is here symbolized by this Chinese character for nothing. It's a Taoist concept. So we know the Lord is there. We don't need to see his picture. A rider's slip or fall could have big-term consequences. The names of riders thrown from their horses were duly noted by officials and later publicized, which tells us that they took this very seriously. Here we see officials jotting down notes. And afterwards, the shamed rider had to undergo an interrogation by a high-ranking official. So it was serious business. Besides studying, practicing the martial arts, and sightseeing, another activity that I hinted at earlier was that he was quite involved in shopping. The top here you see one of the more important shopping guides to Edo and a number of famous stores. On the bottom left, this is Echigoya, a famous dry goods store. On the bottom right, this is a used clothing market. Clothing was one of the most valuable things that samurai owned. Now, samurai were not supposed to be concerned with money, as I mentioned, given their social mission as leaders and moral exemplars. But given the urban existence that most samurai lived, they had little choice but to be drawn into the commercial economy. Nonetheless, Masana embraced this part of his life. During his year in Edo, he actually purchased more than 100 items, including hanging scrolls, pieces of calligraphy, books, an animal skin blanket, pottery, and even a desk. Here, these are not his items, but these are examples of them that other samurai bought. The desk you can see here, pieces of calligraphy. Calligraphy at the time is more highly valued than painting, which may surprise you. Swords, of course, he was an avid collector of. But what he was most enthralled with, and I wholly concur with this obsession, was collecting sword guards. He collected over 20 of them during the year. He doesn't say what he did with them, but I suspect that he traded them because he was known to trade different works of art in order to buy something of more value. So we know he was highly engaged in this market, had an entrepreneurial streak, was a connoisseur. On one occasion, he traded 15 pieces of calligraphy for an expensive scroll by a Confucian scholar with whom Kumazawa Banzan, the second samurai I talked about tonight, actually studied with. Masana, as I said, was obsessed with sword guards. There was a fire broke out, and what was the thing he went back to collect? His sword guards. Right? He you guessed it. Two of the purchases he made in Edo seem to have been made with the first riding ceremony in mind. A tassel in the shape of a paulownia leaf, designed to be placed on top of the helmet, or rather on top of the flag that went on the back of the rider's horse to help identify the rider. Here's a couple more sword guards. And of course, we have the dragonfly on the right. These are a number of different flags that could be appended, placed in the back of the warrior as he rode on the horse. And here you can see how that actually worked in this image of a samurai from Tosa. Masana actually took part in it. He purchased a surcoat such as this, and one imagines that he wore it at the first riding ceremony and must have cut a very fine figure, as does this wonderful example from the exhibit here today. You can see how that worked. So in conclusion, let me say that Masana's fourth trip to Edo came in 1854 at a time of cataclysmic political change in Japan. The previous year, Commodore Matthew C. Perry and his black ships arrived from the US in Japanese waters, presented their demands to the Japanese government to open up, and came back in 1854 with more than 100 cannon and 2,000 soldiers to back up the request. Fortunately, there was no recourse to war. The Japanese agreed to a peace treaty, and unfortunately, the shogun's handling of the issue led to his being toppled from power and the formation of a new government, which put authority back in the emperor's hands. Perry's coming turned Japanese society upside down. There was a run on weapons in armor stores. Samurai got out their gear if they still owned it, or got it out of the pawn shop and started practicing again. But fortunately, war was averted. So over the next decade or so, the new government unmade the samurai, abolishing the hereditary status group, taking away the samurai's privileges, their right to carry two swords, their right to commit ritual suicide. Yes, it was a right. Right to carry out revenge killings, their right to earn a stipend from the Lord's coffers. Samurai reacted to this unmaking in a variety of ways, but the one most relevant to this exhibit was to sell off their armor and family heirlooms. Samurai armor, not to mention a whole lot of Japanese art, was acquired by foreigners and found its way into museums and private collections overseas, as you can see here. But that is a topic for another day and probably another scholar. And so I will end here, and thank you for your attention.